Section 4, the War of 1812. Background knowledge. In the previous sections, we have learned how the first three U.S. presidents worked hard to avoid war with Britain and France. In this section, we will learn why, despite these efforts, the United States finally went to war. The move toward war. Tension with Britain was high when James Madison took office in 1809. Americans were angry at Britain for arming Native Americans in the Northwest. Americans also resented the continued impressment of American sailors by the British. To most Americans, the country's honor was at stake. They felt a new sense of American nationalism, pride in one's country. In 1810, two strong nationalists, Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, became leaders in the House of Representatives. Clay, Calhoun, and their supporters were called war hawks. Those who were eager for war with Britain. Opposition to war was the strongest in New England. Many New Englanders believed war with Britain would harm American trade. Relations with Britain worsened steadily in the early months of 1812. In the spring, the British told the United States they would continue impressing sailors. Meanwhile, Native Americans in the Northwest began new attacks on frontier settlements. In June, Congress declared war on Britain. Early days of the war. The war did not come at a good time for the British, who were still at war in Europe. However, Britain was not willing to meet American demands to avoid war. Providing Native Americans with support was one way of protecting Canada against the American invasion. When the war began, Americans were confident that they would win. It soon became apparent that the United States was not prepared for war. Jefferson's spending cuts had weakened Americans' military strength. The Navy had only 16 warships ready for action. The Army also was small, with fewer than 7,000 men. Many of its officers were poorly trained and too old for combat. In the first days of war, the British set up a blockade of the American coast. A blockade is the action of shutting a port or road to prevent people or supplies from coming into an area or leaving it. By 1814, the British Navy had 135 warships blockading American ports. After reinforcing their troops, the British were able to close off all American ports by war's end. A major sea battle was fought at the beginning of the war. In August 1812, the USS Constitution defeated the British warship Guerriere in a fierce battle. According to tradition, American sailors named the Constitution Old Ironsides because British artillery fire bounced off the ship's thick wooden hull. To the Americans, it seemed as if the Constitution were made of iron. The war in the West and South. In the West, the Americans and British fought for control of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. Both sides had Native American allies. Invasion of Canada. Even before the war began, warhawks were demanding an invasion of Canada. They expected Canadians to welcome the chance to throw off British rule. In July 1812, American troops under General William Hull invaded Canada from Detroit. Hull was unsure of himself. Fearing he did not have enough soldiers, he soon retreated. The British commander, General Isaac Brock, took advantage of Hull's confusion. His army of British soldiers and Native American warriors quickly surrounded Hull's army and forced it to surrender. The British captured more than 2,000 American soldiers. It was a serious defeat for the United States. American forces had better luck on Lake Erie. Both sides were aware of the importance of controlling the lake. A key 3-hour battle took place at Put-in-Bay in the west part of the lake in 1813. During the battle, an American flagship was badly damaged. The American commander, Oliver Hazard Perry, switched to another ship and continued to fight until it was won. Perry announced his victory with a dramatic message. "We have met the enemy and they are ours." With Americans in control of the lake, the British were forced to leave Detroit and retreat back into Canada. As the British and their Native American allies retreated, the Americans under General William Henry Harrison pursued them. They followed the British into Canada, defeating them in the Battle of Thames. Tecumseh was among those killed in the battle. Conflict in the South. Native Americans also suffered defeat in the South. In the summer of 1813, Creek warriors attacked several Southern American settlements. Andrew Jackson took command of American forces in Georgia. In March 1814, Jackson defeated the Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. The treaty that ended the fighting forced the Creeks to give up millions of acres of land. Final battles. In 1814, the British finally defeated Napoleon. This allowed Britain to send many more troops across the Atlantic to fight against the United States. The British attack Washington and Baltimore. The new British strategy was to attack the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., in August 1814. A British force marched into the city. Dolly Madison, the president's wife, gathered up the president's important papers and fled the White House. The British set fire to several government buildings, including the White House. Americans were shocked to learn that their army could not defend Washington. The British now moved on to Baltimore. Their first object was Fort McHenry, which defended the city's harbor. British warships bombarded the fort throughout the night of September 13th, 1814. A young American, Francis Scott Key, watched the attack. At dawn, Key saw the American flag still flying over the fort. The Americans had beaten off the attack. On the back of an old envelope, Key wrote a poem that he called the Star-Spangled Banner. It told the story of his night's watch. The poem became popular and it was set to music. In 1931, Congress made it the national anthem of the United States. The war ends. By 1814, Britain had tired of war. Peace talks began in Ghent, Belgium. On Christmas Eve, 1814, the two sides signed the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war. News of the treaty took several weeks to reach the United States. In that time, the two sides fought one more battle. In January 1815, American forces under General Andrew Jackson won a stunning victory over the British at the Battle of New Orleans. Protest and peace. From the start, there had been opposition within the United States to the War of 1812. As the war dragged on, Federalist critics of President Madison spoke out more strongly, criticizing what they called Mr. Madison's War. The New Englanders, in particular, disliked the war, mainly because the blockade had badly damaged New England trade. In December 1814, a group of Federalists met in Hartford, Connecticut. Some delegates to the Hartford Convention suggested that the New England states succeed or withdrawal from the United States. While the delegates debated, news of the peace treaty arrived. With the war over, the Hartford Convention quickly ended. To some Americans, the War of 1812 was the second war of independence. Once and for all, the United States secured its independence from Britain. European nations would now have to treat the young republic with respect. Pride at this achievement brought the confidence of Americans to a new height. Looking back and ahead, after the War of 1812, Americans entered a new era of confidence. Tensions between regions, which had been high during the war, cooled with the coming of peace. In the post-war period, Americans enjoyed a period of calm and unity. As you'll read in the next chapter, this era paved the way for major expansion in American democracy.